So today, Iraq, like Yugoslavia, is an artificial nation cobbled together by the peacemakers out of a host of nationalities, religions, often hostile and feuding tribes and leaders. We all know about the Shiites, the Sunnis, the Kurds. That was in Mesopotamia. In Yugoslavia, we had the Serbs, the Croats, the Slovenes, the Bosnians, Macedonians, Montenegrins, a host of countries. And nobody in the West really had any idea in those days, in 1919, how deeply rooted the feelings of each of these people were, the ethnic feelings, centuries of religious and ethnic hatred, the hostility and violence that really had marked their history, one against the other. It's interesting, the leader of the Middle East Committee of Wilson's Inquiry, I don't know if you know about Wilson's Inquiry. The Inquiry was like a think tank that he assembled, one of the best minds, supposedly, in each of the regions of the world that he knew that the United States was going to have to concern itself with in Paris. And he brought the inquiry, the bulk of it, to Europe with him on the SS George Washington, which he came on. But the leader of the Middle East unit of the inquiry was a Columbia professor, Columbia University professor named William Westerman. And he was an expert on the Middle East. He was an expert on the Crusades, which means his expertise ended somewhere around the year 1300. This was 600 years later. Well after the Seventh Crusade. His unpublished diary, I found it in the Columbia Archives. So there was a welter of sort of wide-eyed and naive, if deeply held convictions. But that was one of the principal problems. And I described one interesting encounter in Paris. The Emir Faisal, who was the leader of the Hijaz, who was a large swath of the Middle East, including portions of Mesopotamia, what's now Saudi Arabia. He came to Paris as the principal Arab spokesman, along with his British counterpart, T.E. Lawrence, who later is Lawrence of Arabia. Faisal was looking towards some sort of loose federation of microstates in the Middle East. He had an amazing dinner with the American delegation, and it was described by Westerman in his diary, and the diaries of several other people who were at that dinner as well. Everybody kept diaries in those days. There were no logs and so on. So everybody kept diaries to go home each night, and they either write or type in these diaries. And it was a great way of triangulating on what went on, was to see events that were told in these diaries by multiple different people. So this dinner was well chronicled. And Faisal said he was looking towards some sort of loose federation of microstates in the Middle East. At one point he told them, he said, look, he said, you in the U.S. have 48 different states. In those days, there were 48 now, 50. No, 48 states, and one nation. Why can't the Middle East have half a dozen states and one federation in some fashion? Well, it was a worthwhile question, but it was totally ignored by the short-sighted and really selfish peacemakers in Paris. And I'll come back to the reason for that. But first, I'll look at another section of the Middle East, if I may, for a moment, and that was Palestine. That was another nation that was effectively created as a promise years before. Of course, many of you probably know about before the peacemakers ever assembled in Paris, you know first about the Sykes-Picot agreement, whereby the French and the British divided up the Middle East. Then the British, in turn, the Balfour Declaration that awarded their part of the Middle East, Palestine, to or a portion of it to the Jews for their state. As I described in some detail in this issue.
That was voted by the United Nations.
I beg your pardon?
Palestine was divided in 1947 by the United Nations, not by the British.
Well, officially, but in fact, they actually gave it. In fact, they actually gave it to the
British Jews.
Right. Thank you. At any rate, it was the nation that was carved out of Palestine that eventually became a Jewish state in 1948. In fact. It was a product of careful nurturing by Chaim Weizmann, who was a Jew from the Pale of Settlements, and he'd come to London. He provided great services to the British, actually, during the war as a chemist. He invented an extraordinary process of aniline chemistry that was very useful to the British war effort. But and he was an extraordinary diplomat and negotiator. He forced the British government to sort of ignore their basest instincts and do what seemed to be right at the time, and that fight was giving that territory to the Jews. It was, again, though, it was a case of the best intentions going awry through the myopia and the hubris of those who assembled to draft the peace. Palestine was a territory, and Israel was a country that proved to be another of those nations whose boundaries were crafted with little understanding or concern of those who would live there, that there were Arabs in that part of the world, as well as Jews, and yet the Arabs were all ignored in dividing up this territory in some fashion, either unofficially, as was the case after World War I, or officially in 1947, as you mentioned, when the United Nations was created. A month or so ago, my boss, Steve Forbes, had a tea at his townhouse for the Israeli finance minister, Roni Bar-On. And so I had a chance to chat privately with Bar-On at the time, and I asked him, I described how the Palestinians, Arabs, and the Jews were all crammed together by these people in 1919 who really had no understanding of who they were actually trying to assemble into one nation or territory. They were forced to live by Jowl as one small community, much like the Kurds, the Shiites, the Sunnis in Iraq, and how could we expect peace out of that? And he smiled and he said, something I found most encouraging actually. He said, the real hope is through development. That was his ultimate mission. He wanted to raise the standard of living of the Palestinian community to the point where the Arabs living there could suddenly see some real hope of reaching a level of development that approached that of their Israeli neighbors next door. And only then could the envy and the hostility be removed, and they could see that they would get much more out of this, not by throwing rocks and bombs, but in fact by cooperating so that they could all reach some kind of a condominium. Nothing like this has really been considered since 1919, when the Paris Peace Conference and the agreements that immediately followed that, the Treaty of Versailles especially, set up these territories. There were a lot of others who were completely ignored at the time, and again, we're paying the price of that today as well. There was a busboy at the Ritz Hotel in Paris who actually began originally working here at the Ritz in London. His name was Win Tapan, Win who will succeed. And he came to Paris hoping to be able to win self-determination for his own homeland of Cochin China, which was then, of course, a French territory. He drafted a set of 8 points, which have actually since become the foundation of Vietnamese law today. It's like their Constitution, Bill of Rights, in fact, all sort of rolled into one. It was an extraordinary document, and he went around to each of the delegates in Paris and all delegations and tried to get them to accept it, or at least to consider it, while they were considering all of the other demands from all of the other parties there. And basically, he got the back of their hand from every one of these delegations. And he became so frustrated in his efforts to win some kind of an agreement for his homeland, some sort of independence or self-determination, that he turned socialist and then communist, went to Moscow, and 30 years later, he took the nom de guerre of Ho Chi Minh. Now imagine how the history of Vietnam would have been different if they had paid some attention to this man who would later become Ho Chi Minh. But they didn't.